This video takes you through the story of a Northern Pacific Railroad disaster, the Brainerd Bridge collapse of July 27, 1875. On March 8, 1871, a construction crew tested the new Northern Pacific Bridge in Brainerd. A locomotive slowly crossed the new bridge toward the other side. Members of the crew held their breaths, not knowing what to expect. Cheerfully, there were no issues with the bridge. A Duluth newspaper that carried the story proclaimed that the land between Lake Superior and the Mississippi River had been spanned by the iron rails. The Northern Pacific Railroad began at Duluth, Minnesota, on the western end of Lake Superior. The big lake provided an easy means to transport the needed construction material for the railroad, and the port of Duluth was the stopping point. The railroad's plan was to cross North Dakota and Montana to reach the west coast, connecting the Great Lakes with the Pacific Ocean. In Minnesota, there were 3 good-sized bridges that needed to be built. The first was the one at Brainerd. The second was across the Crow Wing River near Motley, and the last was across the Red River at Fargo-Moorhead. On February 15, 1870, crews were set to begin construction on the new railroad at the Northern Pacific Junction, which was just southwest of Duluth. The junction was actually where it would push west from the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad, which ran from Duluth to St. Paul. The Northern Pacific had negotiated rights to use the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad from the junction into Duluth, which passed through the dells of the St. Louis River. Citizens of Duluth and the surrounding area did not want this event to go unnoticed. The Duluth Minnesotian wrote that an event of such significance and magnitude should not pass without some formal celebration. Therefore, a large number of teams and sleighs, loaded with passengers, surprised the engineers of the Northern Pacific at the junction around noon. Speeches were made and souvenirs were taken. The contractor, Captain James Starkey, presented the people with a ceremonial pick, shovel, and wheelbarrow as implements used at the groundbreaking of the great railroad enterprise. The Northern Pacific Railroad needed many things to push forward, and proposals and contracts were made left and right. Trees had to be cut down and removed, soil needed to be dug and moved, ties had to be laid, and iron rails needed to be nailed down. It was a huge undertaking. Eventually, the railroad pushed west to Brainerd, where the first big bridge across the Mississippi River was located. Ferdinand E. Canda held the contract for building this bridge, as well as the bridge over the Crow Wing and Red Rivers. Canda was from Chicago, and in 1870 he would have been about 28 years old. Canda would not just work on structures in Minnesota, but westward to Yellowstone Park. The Brainerd Bridge had 3 spans of equal length, 140 feet. The east approach was 100 feet long, while the western approach was 60 feet long. The middle section was built 60 feet above water level, which would allow the safe passage of steamboats underneath. An excursion train left Duluth on March 11th and headed west to Brainerd. On the train were George B. Sargent, Chief Engineer Ira Spaulding, and a number of invited guests. Sargent claimed that the last spike was driven in just as they arrived at the bridge. They proceeded over the Mississippi as the first official passenger train, then returned to Duluth. There were no issues with this railroad bridge for over 4 years. Then, a few minutes before 8 o'clock on the morning of July 27, 1875, a westbound train departed Brainerd. The train was composed of a locomotive and tender, 10 flat cars loaded with railroad iron, 12 box cars loaded with miscellaneous merchandise, and a caboose. The train proceeded west toward the railroad bridge over the Mississippi. The train began to cross the bridge, traveling at about 4 miles per hour. As the locomotive neared the west side of the bridge, with the rest of the train cars spread out across the bridge, disaster struck. There came a terrible crash, followed by the sound of escaping steam. Townspeople ran to the bridge, where they found a spectacle beyond description. The editor of the local newspaper said the image of the sight would never be forgotten as long as they would live. The middle and western bridge sections were a total wreck. The entire train, consisting of the engine and tender, 22 cars, and the caboose, were at the bottom of the river. For a few moments, everything was as still as death, with the exception of the hissing engine and the sound of rushing water around the cars in the river. In a short space of time, nearly every person in town was present at the riverbank. However, no one knew how many people were on board the train, and whether they were alive or dead. Their attention was soon attracted to the Eastern River Pier, where the remains of the caboose were located. 3 men were observed crawling out of the wreck. Boats were launched from the ferry, and were soon at the accident scene, working to find any survivors. One boat went across the river to locate the engineer and fireman. The engineer never spoke, and died soon after being found. The fireman survived about 15 minutes, but talked intelligibly until he died. He said both men could have jumped and saved themselves, but they both tried to save the engine by breaking the coupling. News of the bridge failure made the front page of the Brainerd Tribune, and spread across the rest of the country. 5 people died in the wreck, including the engineer and fireman. The few passengers on the train were inside the caboose. 3 of the passengers were killed. 5 other passengers were injured. The other 2 railroad employees on the train, the conductor and brakeman, jumped out the back of the caboose onto the track before it went into the river. Caswell and Davy, photographers from Duluth, quickly heard about the wreck. William Caswell traveled to Brainerd and took a series of photographs of the wreck. These photographs are called stereoscopic views, which are 2 near-identical images mounted to a hard cardboard backing. If these images are viewed through a stereoscopic viewer, they give a 3-dimensional aspect to a picture. You can tell who took the picture by the notes around the cardboard backing. This view is one taken of the bridge sometime after its completion in 1871. This view shows the wreck of the bridge from the east bank of the river, south of the bridge. This is a closer view of the previous picture, and shows a man standing on one of the cars. This view also looks to the west, showing more detail of the cars in the river. This view is taken from the north side of the bridge, looking to the west. This view is from the west bank of the river, south of the bridge, looking to the east. And finally, this view is taken from the west side of the river, showing the remains of the locomotive and tender. Typical for the day, the town formed a coroner's jury to investigate the crash and causes of death. The jury was led by Dr. J.C. Rosser, and his investigative team met for parts of 3 days. The jury was composed of 6 men and all 6 were normal townspeople with no particular expertise in the matter. In their conclusions, the jury said the bridge failed because it was constructed of bad material. They noted that the bridge was considered unsafe by a number of people, some of whom were competent in engineering. They said the Northern Pacific Railroad either had incompetent safety inspectors, or they were negligent in making the necessary repairs. They also said the conductor failed to warn the passengers of the impending collapse. Instead, he jumped off the train to save himself. Despite these conclusions, the Brainerd Tribune wrote that questions still remained. First, why had the bridge not failed before? There were instances when multiple engines crossed the bridge together. The editor noted that the testimony of none of the passengers was taken, which seemed odd. Testimony of several engineering experts was taken, and most of them said the bridge was in a safe condition. Finally, it noted that the conductor shouldn't be blamed for saving himself. Meanwhile, several members of the jury brought a large bridge timber into town that had a rotten spot in the middle, hoping it would prove their case. However, it was quickly shown that it was not a piece of the bridge. The Northern Pacific Railroad did its own inquiry into the bridge failure, which included 5 notable railroad engineering experts. They included C.A.F. Morris of the St. Paul and Pacific, F.R. Delano of the same, J.W. Bishop of the St. Paul and Sioux City Railroad, C.H. Pryor of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, and J.S. Sewell of the same. In their report, dated August 3rd, they said they could find nothing wrong with the wrecked bridge spans, either in material or workmanship, and there was nothing wrong with the design of the bridge. They noted they were unable to figure out exactly what happened. However, they theorized that a flat car loaded with rails may have hit a truss, or the rails themselves may have hit a truss, taking out the 2 sections of bridge. Without an eyewitness, the Brainerd Tribune noted that every person in town had their own opinion on what happened. But they would likely never really know. The bridge was repaired in less than 2 weeks, opening for traffic again on August 11th. Once again, a large crowd assembled as the new bridge was tested. 1 locomotive slowly crossed the bridge, with other engines stationed on either side. As the crossing locomotive reached the far side, it let out a loud and long whistle, like a shout of triumph. In reply, the locomotives on either bank also whistled. Once again, the great public thoroughfare was open for business. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.